Thank you so much. Yeah, it's nice to speak with all you. I'm gonna probably run through just some brief materials that I kind of prepared about the how NFTs are actually constructed, how they actually work. But I want this to be kind of interactive. Unfortunately, I'm on a Mac, so I can only look at my presentation. So please unmute yourself and speak up if you have a question, because I won't be able to watch the uh, chat so much. But at the end of the presentation, I'll switch back over and maybe turn on my camera and wave to y'all, and we can do a Q&A then. So yeah, my name is Chris King. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Club NFT and Right Click Save. I think a lot of you were probably expecting Matt Bailey. He's our VP of Engineering at Club NFT, but he was unable to make it. So unfortunately, you're stuck with me. But very nice to speak with you all. For what it's worth, you can email me anytime or DM me. My DMs are open if you have any questions after this class. So the basic idea is that, the way that NFTs are actually constructed really does matter, even to an artist who maybe cares more about the art and the kind of conceptual way that the NFT works and less about the nitty gritty details. It has some really important implications, both for you as an artist and what you're able to do with that NFT, and also for your collectors. And it can impact the value of that NFT as well. So a little bit of preliminary stuff, how do NFTs actually work? Well, there's a thing called a blockchain. For our purposes, all you need to know is that you store smart contracts on the blockchain and you perform transactions on the blockchain. So it's the smart contract that actually tracks the ownership of an NFT and stores and returns the metadata associated with that NFT. So what is metadata? Well, it's a piece of data. It's either on the blockchain or it can be stored off of the blockchain that completely describes the NFT. It's got the name, the description, images, the traits, anything that you might configure when you are minting an NFT, that typically goes into the metadata. The image is then kind of a link inside of the metadata that's usually just a URL. But where is the metadata itself actually stored? So it could be stored on the blockchain or it could be stored off of the blockchain. I'm going to go into a few specific examples in a minute to show you how that all works. But just so you know, on the Ethereum blockchain, when I say data that's stored on the blockchain or off of the blockchain, generally speaking, only about 9% of all Ethereum NFTs store all of their data on the blockchain, meaning 91% store their data off of the blockchain somewhere. And that's really important. A lot of people assume that an NFT is a thing that entirely lives on the blockchain, but actually the most important pieces of an NFT, like the art, are usually not stored on the blockchain. About 2/3 of the time, they're stored on some random web server like OpenSea.com/mynft.jpg. About a quarter of the time, they're stored on something called IPFS, we can get into in a little bit. And then, some very, very small fraction of the time, they're stored elsewhere. Arweave is a little interesting. We'll get into that in a little bit, but probably many of you are familiar with Manifold and kind of the self-custodied contract that Manifold provides. If you use Manifold Studio to mint your NFTs, then by default, they are stored on Arweave. So why does this actually matter? Why should an artist care about any of that stuff? Oh, I'm sorry. And just very quickly, on Tezos, about 100% of all NFTs are stored on IPFS. So there's almost 0% stored on any of these other options. Even the on-chain, the quote-unquote on-chain projects typically store data on IPFS. So why does this all matter? Well, when you store the data on something like OpenSea.com/mynft.jpg, already about 8% of those links, 8% of those NFTs are broken because web servers go down, companies go out of business, somebody new purchases OpenSea.com and they decide that, my NFT.jpg should be a picture of a butterfly instead of a rose, completely, overriding your decision as an artist to create an NFT of a rose. So about 8% of those are already broken. Actually, this data is old. It's from the beginning of last year with the downturn in the market probably gone up pretty significantly. IPFS, on the other hand, is very resistant to NFTs breaking. And if the NFT is entirely on-chain, then it's kind of impossible for the NFT to break unless the blockchain, like Ethereum itself, were to, I don't know, be broken or stop being used by people. So it's, the best option, but on-chain is not an option for most people. The reason is that actually storing stuff on the blockchain is extremely, extremely expensive. Typically, you can only actually store highly compressible data. So 10K PFPs, where all 10,000 images are actually just a compilation of a few different versions of a few different layers of SVG graphics, which are really highly compressed. That is kind of affordably done entirely on the blockchain. But even for something like that, it costs them something like $230,000 for, this is not highly detailed, JPEG art. It's 10,000 SVGs of a few different layers. So it's expensive. Most people don't actually create their art entirely on the blockchain. In fact, the 9% of Ethereum NFTs that are on the blockchain are typically just utility type NFTs, like domain names or passes or tokens granting you access to different things. It's very rare for an entirely for an art project to be entirely on chain. Something like art blocks, for example, is not entirely on chain. They store some data only on their web servers, and it's not reproducible from the blockchain. So in general, you're going to be dealing with off-chain storage, definitely on Ethereum and Tezos. So it's important to understand that the different options there actually matter. So I'm actually going to skip that for a second and look at an example of a on-chain Ethereum NFT. So if you check out, this is just the OpenSea collection page. But if you look at one specific NFT, this one is entirely on-chain. And if you look at the token ID here, there is no link anywhere else. If you go to the contract address, you can read a contract by doing what I'm showing you here. If you look down here at token URI and you plug in the token ID 0, it returns all of this data. This data fully represents everything associated with this NFT. It encodes this image, it has the name, it has all of the traits, which right now they only really have one trait. That's all stored here directly on the blockchain. I can read all of that information from the blockchain, from the contract, using something like Etherscan. This, it's kind of complicated. I could explain, if anyone has a question at the end, I can explain how to decode and actually read this. It's actually not too difficult. But the idea is that there are no links to anywhere else. All of this data is stored right here. So in order to mint this NFT, you have to store all of this data on the blockchain, and that can be somewhat, expensive to do. So to take a look at an IPFS-based NFT, so here's the NFT, the photograph. This is kind of, if you look at this, it's kind of pixels, so it's easy to store this limited amount of data on the blockchain. This is, highly detailed, photorealistic. It is a photo. So it would be really difficult to store all of this data onto the blockchain. If you scroll down and look at the details here, you'll see that unlike the previous one, this token ID is actually a link, the hyperlink. And this brings you to the metadata. And this metadata right here is stored on braindrops.cloud. It's the API that they have, and you can read all of the information that defines this NFT. So when I say that everything about this NFT is defined in the metadata, I'm talking quite literally. I mean, even the name, spiderweb, the description, every piece of information about this is stored here. And if you look at this image link, it's not kind of a normal hyperlink, not a normal web link. This is an IPFS link. So if you plug it into, this is a little technical, but if you plug it into an IPFS gateway, you can find that image. IPFS is just kind of a peer-to-peer network. It's similar to the regular internet, but more like BitTorrent than anything else. So when I plug in this address and download this photo, I'm not downloading it from like one company's web server. I'm downloading it from a bunch of people all around the world who are potentially storing this image. So in general, that's how NFTs are kind of constructed. But one interesting thing to keep in mind, if you look at the contract here, I believe this one is editable. So under write contract, these are all of the methods you can do to modify things. You can update the project base URI. You can renounce ownership. You can mint, add project, et cetera, et cetera. So what does update project base URI mean? If you were to plug in the project ID for this particular series of NFTs, you could change what this NFT is pointing to on the blockchain so that instead of pointing to braindrops.cloud, blah, 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 you could point it to somewhere completely different. And that means that you could potentially update this NFT. Most NFTs are actually editable. They are certainly editable from manifold contracts. OpenSea allows you to edit your NFTs, I believe, until they are sold, or sometimes afterwards. Different platforms have different rules about this, but NFTs are not as immutable as people like to think about. A lot of collectors are kind of surprised sometimes when an artist, as part of the piece, as part of the work, will update that work, maybe change it, or sometimes, quote unquote, rug the collector as a joke, as a piece of kind of performance art. Most NFTs allow this. It's interesting to note that this particular contract allows you to renounce your ownership. There it is, renounce ownership. What that means is that you as the artist would no longer be able to edit your NFT, right? Most collectors don't know to kind of ask the artist to do this, but as an artist, that's something that you could do as kind of a promise that's enforced by the blockchain that you're not going to change this NFT in the future. It's interesting. A lot of people they like the ability to edit NFTs. It's especially useful if you're going to do a reveal mechanic where, maybe you're selling some things and then it's on a certain day that you're going to edit them and reveal what the actual art is. But, consider also that some artists, decades later decide that they don't like something that they did previously and they want to edit it. Look at Star Wars, if all the DVDs that were sold of the original version of Star Wars were automatically updated with the remastered version where, Han Solo didn't shoot first in the bar, for example. That would, be surprising, I think, to the people who bought that DVD and thought that what they were buying was kind of a permanent thing. So, consider that you as an artist, your tastes may change. You may regret something that you made in the future. And unless you specifically renounce it, you have the ability to edit your old NFTs. And that can be a good or a bad thing. So in general, it's important to know that generally the art does not live on the blockchain. The metadata does not live on the blockchain. These things are stored either on a marketplace's web server or IPFS. Some very small fraction are stored on something called Arweave. But in any case, the choice of whether it's a web server or IPFS directly impacts the longevity of that NFT and really impacts your collectors. You should assume that any marketplace that you choose to use to mint your art is going to be out of business in a few years. Think that, every marketplace in the NFT industry is basically a startup, and 90% of startups fail, especially when they're tied to cryptocurrencies, which are, pretty chaotic. As an artist, consider that if the marketplace that you choose to use to mint, or the contract that you choose to use to mint, if you use like your own contract from Manifold or something, consider where the art is actually going. and whether you believe that that place will still be around in a few years or, 10 or 20 years. If that place that it's being stored is just a marketplace's website, chances are that NFT has a shelf life of just a couple years at most. And not many collectors are aware of that issue and that concern. But part of my personal goal at Club NFT is to make more collectors aware of that. So the question as an artist becomes, what marketplaces store things the right way so that if the marketplace goes out of business, you won't be kind of screwed as an artist or as a collector. And there are a bunch. There are a bunch that actually do things the right way. So super rare, known origin. If you're on Tezos, almost everything on Tezos is done the right way. If you want, feel free to reach out to me separately one-on-one if you have a question about a particular marketplace that you use. I don't like to, point fingers at the ones that are doing things kind of the wrong way. Mostly what we try to do is push those marketplaces to change their practices to do it the right way. So as you saw earlier, you are able to go in and edit an NFT and edit where that NFT lives using, set URI or set base URI. The marketplace could use that to fix all of their tokens. So instead of them being stored on, say, a website like this, they could be stored directly on IPFS. So a lot of what Club NFT and myself and some of the larger collectors do behind the scenes is push marketplaces to do that. So if anybody here is or becomes a huge, very important artist, and you want to help with that project of lending your weight and your credibility to pushing marketplaces to do things the right way, reach out to me, please. Be happy to work on that with you. So just to summarize kind of this initial bit of it, again, most NFTs are not stored on chain. IPFS is the only off-chain storage that will probably be around in 10 or 20 years, or even just a couple years. NFTs can be changed on chain by updating it via the contract. But if the NFT image is stored on just a website, then whoever owns that website can actually change the NFT even without the artist's permission. So another reason to use IPFS. Club NFT has a lot of tools that you can use if you collect NFTs to better understand your collection and so forth. But as an artist, it can be difficult to find a marketplace that will store the art that you mint there the right way. So again, please reach out to me. I do want to, point out one last bit, which is Arweave. Certainly, a lot of people here have heard about it. Arweave kind of purports to be a permanent storage solution. IPFS, even though it's great, still requires kind of ongoing maintenance. That's actually a big part of what Club NFT helps collectors do. Or, in the same way that if the NFT stores the art on a marketplace's website, somebody has to pay, Amazon Web Services or something to keep that website alive, right? Arweave claims, you pay once and the data will be stored forever. I don't want to go into a whole tirade against Arweave unless somebody asks in the Q&A portion of this, but it's our opinion that Arweave is not permanent and actually a much worse choice than IPFS. Because if something goes wrong with Arweave, you can't do anything about it. Whereas with IPFS, everybody can do something about it. One good example of IPFS being a great solution is, for a lot of you are familiar with Picket Nunk and how the plug was pulled unexpectedly by the creator in, I think, November of 21. The day that happened, we understood that it was possible that all of the images for all those NFTs might disappear. Fortunately, it was all stored on IPFS. And what that allowed us to do as a community was other people came and hosted those images on IPFS instead. And none of those NFTs disappeared because of that. If that was just, stored on the Hicket Nunk website, all of those NFTs would have been broken. And with Arweave, similarly, if Arweave has any kind of data problem, nobody can fix Arweave. It's a blockchain. It's not just a peer-to-peer network. So I think this was probably more technical than a lot of you were expecting, but I wanted to lay the groundwork for kind of a broad set of topics and just see where you all wanted to go in a longer Q&A session. So I'm going to pause here and first open up if anyone wanted to talk about anything in more detail.
I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I released some of my stuff on Foundation, and I think they use IPFS as well. Is that fairly safe then, do you feel?
Yes. So Foundation, I think, does use IPFS. The interesting thing about IPFS is that I don't know how well Foundation does with their IPFS storage. So typically the marketplace, if they use IPFS, they're not going to set up their own IPFS servers. They would pay either Infura or Pinata or some third party. I don't know how on the back end they actually do their IPFS stuff. But if you have a link to one of your NFTs, I could show everybody kind of how that's actually constructed and how you could actually prove that that's accessible from the rest of the IPFS network. Actually,
sorry, this is Sungraze, isn't it? My question is about the business model of IPFS. Who pays who to do what?
Sure. So IPFS, okay, I like to think of IPFS as a protocol, similar to the web. You know, from a high level that the web is really at the base layer, it's just a way for computers to talk to each other. So the question is, who is running those computers? And the answer is anybody. Anybody who wants to run a web server can run a web server. And the internet is just the way that they communicate with each other, right? IPFS is the same way. So who is running IPFS? Who is making IPFS work? Well, you could. You could download a piece of software, it's really small, and run it on your computer, and now you are part of the IPFS network. The way that IPFS work is very similar to BitTorrent. So I'm going to explain it in terms of BitTorrent. I apologize to anyone who's not really familiar with BitTorrent, but you know that when you try to download a torrent on BitTorrent, you see, oh, this torrent has, say, 5 seeds. And that means 5 other people on the BitTorrent network have that file, and you can download the entire file from them. And there are also peers, people who have parts of the file, and you can download it from them. So IPFS is very similar. The question is, who are the seeds on IPFS? Who is running a server and has the file that I want? By default, there's actually usually only one seeder of an NFT, and that is the marketplace where that NFT was minted. They are either running their own IPFS servers or they're paying Infura or Pinata to do it for them. And they say, here's the file, and as long as we're in business, we'll make it available to everybody who tries to access it through IP. That doesn't sound any better than if it was stored on their website, right? So if they go out of business, their website goes down, sure, but also they probably stop paying to pin that file on IPFS. The difference is that anybody else can also store that file on IPFS. You as the artist, you could do that yourself. The collector can do that. Club NFT could do that. It's just adding more people who have copies of that file and are making it available on IPFS. So in terms of a business model, IPFS is not a blockchain. There are no built-in tokenomics. There's no built-in financial incentive for anybody to do anything, for anybody to store your file, for example. The kind of default incentive is a marketplace doesn't want to go out of business. They don't want all of their NFTs to break. So you can be pretty sure that as long as the marketplace is in business, they have an economic incentive to store those files on IPFS and keep them working. you as an artist, you could run IPFS yourself, or you could pay Pinata or Infura or any other, service to pin those files for you. That's just a contract, like any other. If you sign up for a service that costs $8 a month, you have a business relationship with that service. It's the same with Pinata. You have a business relationship with them. So unlike a lot of these tokenomics schemes where you put money onto the blockchain and hope that the magic of the blockchain is going to continue to pay for your storage, IPFS is very much just similar to Web 2 in the sense that you just make a deal with somebody and they agree to host your stuff. Now, one interesting thing about IPFS is that because it's not a blockchain, there's no consensus, there's no agreement, there's no chain of transactions. The way it works, it's at the protocol level is you have a file of a rose and it's, 10 megabytes. It scans that and does some addition and subtraction and math and cool stuff. And it says, hey, here's a number that uniquely identifies this specific photo of a rose. And it doesn't matter if everyone else on Earth dies and goes away and IPFS crashes and burns. As long as math still works, that number will always uniquely represent this rose. So the cool thing about IPFS is forget about making deals with people to store the image, forget about storing it yourself. Once you have that magic number saying, hey, this is the number for my special rose that I created, and you put that on the blockchain, forget about IPFS. Anybody who has that rose, whether it's you just on your computer's hard drive or the collector who bought it, anyone who has that file of a rose can prove that it is the rose associated with your NFT, because they can do the same math and get the same magic number and say, look, it's the same file. That's one of the nice things. That means that you can just download the files, forget about storing it, forget about paying Pinata and Infura. If you just keep a copy of all of the files that you have minted on IPFS, you can always prove that they are the files for the NFTs that you've minted, which is really, really important. And let me share my screen. I'll dig into this foundation NFT. All right. So you can see the NFT here. You can see it on Etherscan. You can view the metadata, which is stored on IPFS, which is fantastic. So I could go over to Etherscan and look at the contract address and go to the contract and read the contract, go down to token URI. I can plug in 1, because this is token ID 1, and find that we have this file, but they very nicely include a link to the metadata and you can view it directly on IPFS. So here is the metadata, and it's really simple, just a name, description, and image. There are no traits or anything. And you see the image also is stored on IPFS. So I'm going to pop that open and boom. So very interesting to note, IPFS.io is not owned or run by Foundation. It's a totally independent node that's run by Protocol Labs. So this proves that actually your metadata and your image are available on the IPFS network. So yes, Foundation is doing everything correctly from a IPFS perspective. Now, who are they paying? How are they storing this particular image on IPFS? I don't know. They might be running their own server. They might be paying Pinata or whatever. But I do know that if I go over here and I save this image, actually, no, it's it's more complicated than that, which is why Club NFT has a business. They have stored it in a folder. But if I were to download everything associated with this, as well as everything associated with this magic number. This is the magic number I was talking about earlier that uniquely identifies this particular NFT's data. If I downloaded those 2 files and didn't change a single bit in them, I could always prove that I have the right files for this particular NFT. And even if Foundation goes down, even if the IPFS service they're using goes down, I could always re-upload those two files to any other IPFS server or run my own IPFS server, and my NFT is magically not broken.
I have a
I did
question.
want to, yeah, please go ahead.
Well, amazing headband. Love to see it both on you and Jason, first of all. That's not the question though. OpenSea, what's OpenSea doing? Because for half of us, it's the gateway drug to NFTs. And when I realized the fact that I had already been watching NFTs for a while, bought my first shitty NFT out of some whatever reason, by the time I realized, oh, I could mint my work on OpenSea, I realized I could do it for free. And the escrow model, I understand the mechanics. They make the first collector mint for you, but where does that leave me? Like you said, an artist could go and revoke their rights just like they could change, even if after selling. What about on OpenSea? What if I've minted on OpenSea?
So there are so many pieces to the answer to that question. So I'm going to say a whole bunch of different things that may not sound directly related to each other, but they're all things to keep in mind about OpenSea. So first of all, like you mentioned, OpenSea is, broadly speaking, a place where you can buy and sell NFTs that were created anywhere. You can create NFTs directly on OpenSea, but you could also create them on, say, art blocks and then buy and sell them on OpenSea, right? So let's forget about all of the NFTs that are created anywhere else. Because if you create the NFT on art blocks or if you create the NFT on Super Rare, the answer to your question doesn't depend on OpenSea. The answer to your question depends on art blocks and Super Rare and how they built those NFTs and what their contract allows, right? So for NFTs that were specifically minted on OpenSea, one interesting statistic is that about 99% of those NFTs are not stored on IPFS. About 1% of them are. So whose fault is this? Is OpenSea, doing something wrong? Kind of. You go to OpenSea.io. When you create, actually, I'm not going to connect my wallet, so I won't show you. But when you go to OpenSea and you create an NFT, there is a button. It's near the bottom that says freeze metadata. So I mentioned earlier that you can, as an artist, go in and edit your NFTs. You can update the NFT, you can change the artwork, you can do all kinds of stuff. OpenSea allows you to do that. While you are doing, sorry, go ahead.
That button, that freeze metadata button, seemed extra scary to me because I didn't know what the hell it meant. And I'm like, I don't want to freeze anything in case I don't know what it does. I don't know, man. Let's not freeze anything. Let's not do anything permanent. Like,
So
just so
yes,
you know, point of view.
it is permanent. And what it's basically doing is saying, I, as the artist, renounce my right to change this NFT ever again. And that's great. That's kind of a promise to your collectors that you're not going to edit it, 5 years after you sold it to them, right? So that's kind of a nice thing to do. But it does mean that if you discover that you had a typo in your description that you wish you could edit, you can't do that anymore. So what is the state of the NFT before and after clicking the freeze metadata button? Well, while it's editable, they don't store it on IPFS. They just store it on their own private servers. And if, OpenSea goes out of business, then anything that's, metadata was not frozen goes away because it's not stored on IPFS. It's just stored on OpenSea's servers. Once you say, hey, I am done editing this NFT, and you click freeze the metadata, it does two things. Number one, it takes all of the data that you were storing on their private server, uploads it to IPFS, and changes the NFT to point to IPFS instead of pointing to the private server. And then number two, it prevents any future changes to that NFT. So it's a permanent solution, but it does move everything over to IPFS. Now, there's one problem. You might be wondering, well, I created an NFT a year ago and I never clicked that button and I sold it. Can I go in and freeze the metadata now? No. As far as I know, unless they've changed this recently. Once the NFT has been sold, you can no longer freeze the metadata. You can only freeze it after you have, before you have sold it. So yeah, 99% of the NFTs minted on OpenSea will never be pointing to IPFS unless they change their policy or do some kind of mass migration. So it's very interesting. And well, first of all, did that answer your question?
I mean, yes, it hurts me, but it's yes, because 95, not 95, but a good chunk of the Ethereum sales I've made were my first introduction to the NFTs, and they're on OpenSea, they're on the shared contract. And
Yeah.
I mean, OpenSea is too big to fail at this point, but to know that it's linked to their success is kind of weird.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people don't really realize, as much as we like to pretend that, you know, Web3 means you don't have to trust anybody. It's a trustless architecture. Actually, by default, the way that it all works, there are actually several people you have to trust. Number one, you have to trust whoever created the contract. In this case, that's OpenSea. They have the ability to do all kinds of things without your permission. They could change the NFT themselves in most cases. And then number two, you have to trust whoever is storing the data off chain. In this case, again, OpenSea. So you are really tied to the marketplace. And this actually leads directly to Icosys's follow-up question about Manifold and Arweave. So Manifold, Manifold is actually fantastic. The wave of the future. I don't know if Manifold themselves is going to be the long-term solution. I know that Super Rare has launched self-custodied contracts, and some other projects have launched self-custody contracts. So what's the big deal? What does all that mean? A self-custodied contract means that you are the owner of that smart contract. You have complete control over the smart contract. So unlike where you're sharing that control with OpenSea, OpenSea has the ability to come in and edit your NFT or delist it, or even burn your NFT if they need to for legal reasons. When you own the contract and nobody else owns it, and you're not sharing that control with anybody else, you have complete control over all of the NFTs that you've created. So that's awesome. Wave of the future, and I think everyone's going to be moving that direction. Maybe not on Manifold, but definitely through self-custody contracts in general. So the second piece of that question is, okay, so what does Manifold specifically actually do? They, just for simplicity's sake, because it is the easiest solution, they use Arweave. When you use Manifold Studio, you create a contract, you deploy it using your wallet, it goes onto the blockchain, and then they give you this studio to create NFTs that uses your contract underneath. Just because they want to keep it simple and really easy to understand, they use Arweave because Arweave claims that stuff will be stored forever. Now, again, I don't think that's really true. Since you own your contract, your smart contract, you could, if you use, OpenSea, and you went over, here is the Icosys's contract, and we can look at the contract right as proxy. So, Icosys, you have the ability to set token URI. You have the ability to do all kinds of cool stuff here, but this is the important piece. Let's first read the token. This is Icosys's contract, and you can see it's created by icosys.eth, right? So really, they own this contract. Now, if we go down to token URI, I think you shared, I just want to make sure I get the right one. Super Rare, which token ID is? Let's assume it's 1. I can't read the rest of that. Token ID 1. So you see that if you ask for the token ID, it points to Arweave. And if we load that on Arweave, here's all that metadata that I mentioned earlier. Now you, Ikasis, have something really cool. You have the ability to call, right as proxy, set token URI. You could say, hey, for token ID 1, the one that I was just reading, instead of pointing to rweave.net slash blah, 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 I want to point that to IPFS colon slash blah, blah, blah. So what does this mean? You could take this file, you could take the animation, the image, all of these things, upload them to IPFS yourself, adjust this metadata now to point to IPFS, slash some new numbers and letters. And then once this thing is updated and uploaded to IPFS, you could go to your contract, set token URI, and change it to point to IPFS. So Manifold allows you, as the creator of your NFTs and owner of your contract, it allows you to use IPFS. It allows you to do whatever you want. You can do all kinds of crazy things, but it's a huge pain in the ass. The only default option they provide that magically works using, Manifold Studio is Rweave. They just make everything happen magically for you. I did actually put together some instructions for adventurous, fairly technical people who might be interested. Here are all the instructions you would need to modify all of the NFTs you've minted on a Manifold contract to use IPFS. I will paste that right there for you. But it's a pain in the butt. It would be possible to create a website or a script that kind of does this automatically for artists. If that's something that people want, I could try to throw that together. But yeah, the cool thing about owning your smart contract is you have full control over things like this. You can change it to use whatever you want. And if there's something better than IPFS, you can change it to use that instead as well. And Numenal, please, what's your question?
Thanks, Chris. I've been a big fan of Club NFT for a long time. In fact, I met you in a weird small office with a mariachi band in New York, which was a
Yes.
hilarious time. But this talk is really helping me understand what's going on behind it. And I have my Club NFT up, and I've always been kind of curious about a few things. Like there's has off-chain files, yes, and then a number. Is that how many files are shared, like BitTorrent? Is that what's going on there?
Oh no, it's different. So if you click on that NFT, it will show you, say the number is 4, it'll show you what those 4 files are and where they live.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I will try to show this to everyone here. Pull up. So here's an example. Has off-chain files? Yes, 7. So if I just click here, here are the 7 off-chain files. These ones are all stored on IPFS, but you can see that the display, the thumbnail, the artifact, blah, 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 a few different formats here. They're all stored on IPFS.
Got it. And then also I'm curious if you could explain the difference between the backup and the pinning.
Yes. So that is more like the seeding. So I mentioned that when you go on BitTorrent, you're hoping to find 5 seeders or 10 seeders, more than 0 people who have a copy of the file that you want to download. Pinning is the process of seeding in the context of IPFS. So right now, the marketplace is pinning that file. They're declaring to the whole IPFS network, we have the file. If you want it, come get it from us. You can have other people pinning the file, all announcing to the network, hey, we have the file if you want it. So if right now, by default, the marketplace is the only place who has that file and is making it available and pinning that file on IPFS, having maybe one extra person pinning that file is good, because then the file will be available on IPFS unless both of those people go offline, right? If Club NFT is doing it for you and the marketplace is doing it for you, then unless both of us go out of business, your file will always be available on IPFS. Now, that's good for keeping it constantly accessible. But let's say nobody cares about NFTs for the next 20 years. and you don't care if it's not accessible. The marketplace goes out of business, Club NFT goes out of business. Nobody cares. If you try to download that file on IPFS, it's not available anymore. But 20 years from now, somebody's thinking, this NFT would be worth $10 billion if only it was working. If you have a backup of those files stored anywhere, it doesn't have to be available on IPFS. You could store the backup on Google Cloud. You could store it on your hard drive. You could write it on a DVD and store it in a bank vault. If you have a copy of those files, a backup of those files, you could 20 years later, even though the NFT has been broken for 20 years, take those files, upload them to IPFS, and magically your NFT is no longer broken. So we see the backup as a permanent solution. Just keep the backup safe and you'll always have an option. Whereas pinning is like, do you want the file to be working right now? We think you probably want both. But keep in mind that pinning, it costs money. You have to run a server, you have to do some stuff. Whereas backup, you could store that yourself and you can do that for free.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So glad that you all are doing this.
If you guys are curious, let's see if I can show you. This is Tezos. I'm going to show you Jason Bailey, Art Gnome's collection. There are a number of NFTs that are, people typically think are stored entirely on chain. So I mentioned art blocks, right? So art blocks, this is an art blocks NFT, but it has off-chain files. It has the token, the metadata is stored on token.artblocks.io, right? That's not IPFS, and it's not on the blockchain. This is just a regular web server. The image, believe it or not, is stored on Artblocks' website. And the animation for this NFT is stored on Artblocks' website. Now, if that's the case, why do people think of Artblocks as being stored on chain? Because their contract on chain also allows you to generate that animation. If you go to the contract and read it, hash, token ID to hash, you plug that in, and then you download the code also from their thing, blah, 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 blah. You call a few methods and then run some code. It will generate this animation. So cool. That means that even if this file disappears, you can still generate this file, right? But one interesting thing is that nowhere on the blockchain do they store all of this information, all of the traits, the features, et cetera, et cetera. If their website goes down, there's no way to restore a lot of this data. It's permanently lost. And that's the case, believe it or not, with most quote unquote on-chain projects. Any questions, any thoughts? Want me to talk about another topic?
Hi, Pavel here. Thanks for the knowledge. I love it. I love the technical side of NFTs, absolutely. I wanted to ask you if you know any projects on Tezos that are stored fully on-chain. I mean, not IPFS, but fully on-chain. Because it's super expensive to store data on Ethereum. And since Tezos is, well, so cheap, I assume there could be some.
Yeah, interesting. There are. It's something like less than 1% of NFTs on Tezos are stored entirely on chain. But let me pull up an example of one. If I can find it. 8. Let me see if I can dig it up. I think it's called 8Bidu. Oh, this is such a large wallet. It's a pain in the butt. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that there's not a lot of value, I mean, in my opinion, in actually doing everything entirely on chain, because IPFS is actually a really great solution. Let's say that, you know, Ethereum becomes unpopular and people stop using Ethereum. Well, anything that was stored entirely on Ethereum is gone. Whereas if it was stored on IPFS, you could just take the exact same content and remint it on a different blockchain that is popular. And you can always prove that it's the original files because of the math thing that I mentioned earlier. So that's one interesting thing. And the other thing is that even I can't find 8x2, even the ones that are stored entirely on chain, Tezos is, you know, less expensive than Ethereum, but it's still expensive enough that you don't typically try to store everything on chain. When you make the decision to do something entirely on chain, that's actually more of an artistic decision than a technical one, because that means you're not going to be doing photos with, you know, high detail. Oh, here's 8x2. So they technically have one link, which is just a stupid broken link. It doesn't actually mean anything. The entirety, you know, 8x2 is like an 8x8 pixel image. The entirety of that image is actually stored on the blockchain. So it's a little bit misleading here because for whatever reason, they kind of designed it poorly. They do actually have one URL that points to something off chain, but it's like a fake URL that doesn't do anything. That's, as far as I know, the only Tezos that actually does everything entirely on chain. But anyway, back to what I was talking about. Yeah, so once you've decided you want to do something on chain, it's an artistic decision, because that means that just unless you're going to spend $1 billion, you really have to like try to create art that can be fit into just a few bytes. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the demo scene, but it's, you know, really, really smart people who create these programs designed to run on like an old Atari. They, you know, would fit in less than a single old school floppy disk, and they can generate, you know, 20-minute long videos with all kinds of crazy cool effects and, you know, music, synthesized music, all stored in this very tiny file running on an ancient computer. That's an art form. You could have made the same video in a very different way, much easier, by not trying to fit it onto an old Atari, right? So on-chain art is very similar to that. You know, if you want to do on-chain art, that means you're really committing yourself to a much smaller file size and doing something interesting in terms of generative code. Whereas, you know, I wouldn't say that somebody who's trying to make, you know, photos or photorealistic or just different types of art could try to find a way to squeeze that on chain. It's just a different art form that doesn't lend itself to on chain storage. ERC 6551. Oh boy. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with ERC 6551. Let me token bound accounts. Oh, interesting. Okay, so this is kind of every 721 token suddenly becomes a wallet as well. Yeah, interesting. I'm not sure what the mechanics of that would all look like. One thing I'd say that is definitely changing things in the industry, and it's really related to the technical side of things, is again the move to self-custodied contracts. I think that as the technology to create NFTs has become, you know, any developer can put a website up that allows you to mint an NFT. There are a lot of kind of standard smart contracts out there. It's not like voodoo science anymore. We don't need marketplaces to provide those tools anymore. We really just need marketplaces to put eyeballs in front of our art and, you know, give people a buy button. That's a very different thing than they've traditionally been doing. So I do think that more and more people are going to be moving over to self-custody contracts, owning the tools of creation of the NFTs, and then really just using marketplaces to do the buying and selling because they have the audience. And I think that's going to have some important, you know, impacts as well on royalties. I'd say the next interesting ERC that I would keep my eye on is one that I don't think exists yet, but it'll be built-in on-chain royalties through self-custodied contracts, where it's just the sale is enabled by a marketplace and you're giving them some percentage, but the royalties and everything else is managed by your own contract. Unfortunately, I think that would require a standard that's not compatible with existing NFTs. Cool. Yeah, so ordinals on Bitcoin are very interesting. I wouldn't be surprised. So on-chain storage is expensive, but there are things that you're not supposed to do that the creators of the blockchain didn't think people would try to do when they first, set the rules for how everything works. Um, on Bitcoin, you can kind of get really, 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 really like super cheap storage by taking advantage of kind of a loophole in how things are accounted for. And that enables ordinals. So you can store the image and the art entirely on the Bitcoin blockchain because you're doing a thing that nobody thought anyone was ever going to do. Ethereum had a similar kind of mechanism, which they either are or have already gotten rid of, rather than storing data, in the places where you're supposed to store data. You could kind of store it in old logs, like old log messages of like, hey, somebody called this, method. It's just like a text file. You could read the data out of that, and you could store big, big chunks of data in the log and retrieve them. But you weren't supposed to do that. So anytime you have one of these super cheap, magical ways of storing data on the blockchain, beware that the people who run the blockchain, the people who run these nodes, don't like that. And they're probably going to update the blockchain and close that loophole for you. I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if Bitcoin did release a fork, which basically turned off the storage mechanism that Ordinals uses, similar to how Ethereum cut off access to old logs. So any NFTs that were taking advantage of storage in those logs are broken if it's after, I think, 30 days or something. But yes, in general, vanilla JavaScript is my favorite as well. It's interesting trying to write all of your own kind of graphics primitives without using some of these libraries. One thing to keep in mind is that say you store all of your art perfectly and your files, like say you're doing generative art with JavaScript, all of your JavaScript files are saved for 10,000 years. If you're using libraries and somebody isn't keeping a copy of those libraries somewhere, nobody's going to be able to use your code anyway. So it's really important to think through what additional dependencies you have. This really is specific to generative art or any art that's kind of based on a web page and not just a static image or a rendered video. But yeah, something else to think about. Any other thoughts or questions?
Chris, Jerry here at Sungrazers. I try to sort of think simplistically about these things as far as possible. And the other thing is that I try that, what I learn on Tuesday is still valid on Thursday. Having started your talk with frightening the hell out of all of us, I've sort of got to the point of going, okay, my takeaway on this is, number one, Tezos is 100% on IPFS, and therefore that's good. And I happen to know the same is true of Hedera, which is another area that we're in. And from a personal management of our NFTs created and our NFTs purchased, I tend to save the IPFS URL for each one. And I haven't got around to doing it yet, but I also intend downloading all of those because of that instance that you were talking about where 20 years after everything's gone down, you can resurrect it. With those two actions taken on those two blockchains that I know are 100% on IPFS, can I go back to bed and relax?
Yes, great question. In my opinion, yes, honestly. So I there are a million things that can go wrong. You know, a lot of people today are just now discovering that many marketplaces have the ability to edit or even burn your NFTs, the ones that you created without your permission. That may scare you. There are a lot of scary things still, but generally speaking, my advice for collectors is you really only need to do three things to be 99.99% safe. Number one is back up all of your IPFS based NFTs and probably don't buy web server based NFTs. Or if you discover the one that you bought is web server based, maybe sell it before that marketplace goes out of business. Number two, use a hardware wallet because that does, keep you safe from most hacking or hacking attempts or viruses. And number three, use a hot and a cold wallet. Honestly, hot and a cold wallet would have solved 99% of the fraudulent, losses that people are always tweeting about. Just those three things for a collector. For an artist, I suggest, again, keep your originals. The things that you actually uploaded when you minted, keep those. That should be about as good as a backup, unless the platform also modifies your image as you upload it. Maybe they compress it or resize it or whatever, in which case you're going to want to just download the backup from IPFS. But also number two is really be very thoughtful about who you trust. Reputation matters a lot. I think that a marketplace, to the degree that a marketplace has any control over the NFTs that I create, I would really only entrust a marketplace with that control that I trust. In the end, everything comes down to trust. Everything comes down to people. If you don't trust some website, then you shouldn't be using it to mint your NFTs. If you don't trust the marketplace, if you don't trust the people who run it, I know that Known Origin was a darling of the community, and then they got purchased by eBay, and people were like, "Oh no." I've been in touch regularly with the Known Origin folks, and honestly, I think they're still great people, and they're still trying to do right by the community, and they're not doing any evil corporate stuff. But keep in mind that companies get bought and new owners come in with new priorities. So all that said, if you don't want to worry about anything, self-custody your smart contracts. Use Manifold or use Super Rare's self-custody contracts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you don't have to trust anyone else with control over the smart contract. And B, you get to choose where your data is stored. Always store it on IPFS and keep a backup. With those two things, as an artist, I'm pretty confident. But one last thing to think about. I mentioned about using a hot and a cold wallet. Be very careful what you use to mint. So the wallet that you use to mint your artwork forever is going to be the thing that people look for to say, hey, did artist X actually mint this artwork? And also, who should we pay these royalties to? It's that one wallet. Treat that as a cold wallet. Only use that wallet for minting on a particular platform. Maybe create a new wallet for each platform you might mint on. Because if you use that wallet and you use it on some D app and it gets hacked or whatever, and you lose control over it, doesn't matter. All royalties forever are still going to that wallet. All credit for the NFTs that you've created are still credited to that wallet. So even if you move your money out of that wallet into a safe one and you say, I'm never touching that wallet again, forever that wallet is tied to the work that you've created on the blockchain. So the wallets that you use to mint, treat those extra super securely. Don't use them for anything else. Only use them for minting. And I would really recommend a separate wallet for each platform that you mint on. If one of them gets hacked, at least the rest won't be. Yes, please go ahead about Ledger.
Hi, sorry, Chris. Yes, it's Sarah here from Sungrazers with Jerry. So I think some of us might have seen that yesterday, it was either yesterday or the day before, there was an issue with Ledger.
Yep.
And on several people's Twitter accounts, there's a bit of an interview with the CEO. And I just wondered if you could kind of share with the group, in case anybody's missed it, what happened. And I just wondered what your thoughts were.
Sure thing. So yeah, TLDR, Ledger released a new feature. It's optional. It's opt-in, where they can do some magical math to the private key, which is only ever supposed to be stored on the hardware device and never supposed to even be possible to leave that hardware device. They can do some magical math and get 3 new magic numbers, which you can distribute to 3 different friends. And if you ever forget your magical number, in other words, if you lose your ledger device and you lose your recovery seed phrase and you lose everything, you could ask any 2 of those friends, hey, can you give me the magic numbers that I gave you, combine those back together and get your magical, private key that's supposed to only be stored on the ledger. Now, this surprised people that it's even possible to do this, because people assumed that the magic number, the most important thing that keeps everything secure about a ledger, it should never be able to come out of the ledger. It should always be on the ledger. Now, if we're able to take 2 or 3 pieces out of the ledger, which could then be combined to get that magic number, that means that we're able to extract the number from the ledger, right? This was a big surprise to a lot of people. In fact, I believe maybe some intern working at Ledger who was manning their Twitter account years ago may have even claimed that it's impossible to get your magic number out of the ledger. The truth is, for any of this to work, for Ledger to work, for upgrades to your Ledger device to even be possible, it has to, just by the laws of nature, it has to be possible to extract that magic number from the Ledger device. The way it works is Ledger creates something called firmware. It's software that runs on the Ledger, and they can change that firmware to do whatever they want. They could change that firmware to spit out your magic number like unstoppably and just keep spitting it out for everyone to read. They could do that if they wanted to. But Ledger is the only people who have another magic special key that allows them to install their software onto everyone's ledgers. So if you own a ledger, you do kind of have to trust Ledger not to be making coding mistakes that puts you in danger. And you have to understand that they can, release updates that would potentially expose the secret key on your Ledger device. So because I'm a nerd and I kind of just understood how software updates have to work, I knew that it would always be possible to extract that key from the Ledger if they wanted to. I think the big hoopla, the reason they're getting so much pushback from the community right now is because most people didn't realize that was even possible. And I think actually Ledger at different points in time may have claimed that it was not possible, but it is possible. And the question really comes down to, do you trust Ledger? Do you trust their engineers not to do anything intentionally bad or accidentally bad? For what it's worth, I got a great relationship with, we at Club NFT have a great relationship with the people at Ledger. We released a version of our app in their marketplace. I trust them. I have a Ledger and I'm not at all concerned about this. The feature is opt-in. I trust them that if I opt out, they're not going to secretly steal my key. But this is a decision everyone has to make for themselves. Yeah, this space is not nearly as trustless as everyone assumed it was. You kind of have to trust everybody. Same way you have to trust the person who made your computer. I have a MacBook. I have to trust that Apple isn't, secretly recording all my keystrokes. They could have all of my private keys already. At some point, somebody else built a thing that you're using and you have to trust them.
That's a perfect answer, Chris. Thanks so much. I guess part of it's also because the very first platform we were curated onto in 21 was Known Origin. And, we got a personal relationship with the founders, David and Andy. And we were actually with them last year in England when we were back there. We had a day with them, and it was a really great day. And about 48 hours later, they announced they'd sold to eBay. And we were like, oh my gosh, everything we've just, heard and what we've been building for the last, 9 or 10 months has disappeared. So that's really helpful. And I guess the other thing, in those very early days with KO back in 21, it was great to be curated, and they did a big sort of sales push on the fact that secondary sales would come back to the creators. But what they didn't let us all know was that those earlier contracts we were on were being grabbed by OpenSea, and OpenSea were keeping the secondary royalty, and therefore Known Origin had to actually request that royalty of OpenSea. It wasn't automatic. That obviously changed when the contracts came out, I think in the July or August of 21. We haven't had our fingers burnt, but I guess, like you say, you've just got to do as much research as you can, and we've all just got to share information with each other in our communities. And so thank you for just explaining what you said about Ledger, and what you were saying about KO. The only other real quickie, just to ask you, so I don't hog the floor, is that we're also on Nifty Gateway through a publishing contract with Oshi Gallery, which is an Australian IRL gallery. And I just wanted to ask, I don't think that Nifty Gateway sales are picked up by OpenSea unless the collector actually puts the piece onto OpenSea. I think it's sort of, when you mint on Nifty Gateway, you have the ability to keep the piece on Nifty Gateway until you move it as a collector or an artist onto your Ethereum wallet. Sorry if I'm burbling on, and you can tell me to shush, but thank you for your help, Chris.
Yeah, no. So Nifty Gateway is a whole other level of different and trust. So to your point, Nifty Gateway is kind of like, instead of using the blockchain, they say, hey, well, we have a database and we updated the record and it says that you created this NFT and it says that you sold this NFT and it says that you have $5. None of these things are actually happening on the public blockchain. They're just happening inside of Nifty Gateway's database. So that has a few implications. Number one, all those things that you would want to do are free. You don't have to pay gas for them, because it's very easy for Nifty Gateway to just update their database. But that means that there's no public record except if you use the Nifty Gateway API. They allow other websites to access this data and figure out who owns what and what does the NFT look like. They allow people to access this data from them. But let's say you are a DApp whose only job is to show NFTs that a person owns, and they plug in their wallet. If they plug in their wallet, it's not going to show them owning any of those Nifty Gateway NFTs because that information isn't on the blockchain. So unless you, the creator of the DApp, also query Nifty Gateway's API and say, hey, does this person own anything on your platform? You won't see that. But you can do that. You can, write special code to deal with Nifty Gateway. The way that all works is Nifty Gateway is a self-custodied, is a custodied, not self-custodied platform. Nifty Gateway owns all the NFTs, owns all the cryptocurrency. Everything that all the users are doing on the platform is kind of owned on the blockchain by Nifty Gateway. And when you want to withdraw, whether you want to withdraw the NFTs or your money or whatever, then they put it onto the actual blockchain under your name. There's a big level of trust there. You really got to trust Nifty Gateway to be holding onto your NFTs and your money correctly. You have to trust that they won't go bankrupt. And if they do go bankrupt and shut everything down, that the first thing they do before they go bankrupt is move all of that stuff onto the blockchain for you, which costs money. One of the least likely things that a company going through bankruptcy is going to do is spend more money to protect their users, in my opinion. So, you'd want to withdraw those things before they go bankrupt. So besides the trust, though, it is complicated. Having to access all of this information through Nifty Gateway's special API instead of just reading it on the blockchain, that's like a whole pain in the ass that anyone else in the NFT community who's building a thing has to think about. Do we want to support Nifty Gateway or not? If you go to Club NFT, you'll see we do not support Nifty Gateway. I mean, we do if you have withdrawn those NFTs and it's actually on the blockchain, but what's the point of backing up an NFT's art if the NFT, the token itself, doesn't even exist and will disappear if they go bankrupt? There's not a lot of point, right? So there are multiple layers to custodied platforms like Nifty Gateway. It's similar to many of the exchanges when you purchase or buy or sell, cryptocurrencies. It's expensive to do these transactions on the blockchain. So usually they're not done on the blockchain. They're just done in the company's, database. Hopefully they're being honest. Hopefully they really do have the thing that you think they have on your behalf, and they will give it to you when you ask for it. But, that's one of the reasons that the blockchain was invented. So we don't have to trust the bank. Most people understand now, especially now, that the bank, if people have $1 billion deposited at the bank, they don't have $1 billion sitting in a room. They might have just a few dollars, and they have lent out that $1 billion, right? You have to trust that they'll at least be able to give you your money if you ask to withdraw it. But if everyone asks for it at the same time, they usually don't have it. It could potentially be the same with custodied platforms.
Yeah, great answer, Chris. Thanks very much. Thank you. That's kind of what we thought.
Yep. Any other thoughts or questions? I can go on and on, any topic. What about Exchange and Solana? Dana, could you hop on voice for a second? I'm not sure. What is Exchange?
Hey. Now, I was just wondering about the platform, if it is safe, the way they have the NFTs there.
Is there a specific platform on Solana called Exchange?
Yes.
Oh, here it is.
Yes.
Exchange.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yes.
I will reserve my judgment about Solana itself. I know that a lot of money has been invested in building things on Solana. Let me take a look at one of these NFTs. Oh, this may be a bad example because it is a project with its own website. Maybe. Okay, metadata, solana.fm. All right, so this is interesting. Oh, okay, yeah, these are all stored on Arweave, unfortunately. Yeah, so Solana originally was built using Arweave. In fact, Solana, I think, used Arweave to store all of the blockchain's basic data. They changed Solana to move off of Arweave because it kind of sucked. But a lot of the marketplaces and stuff on Solana are still heavily committed to storing their data on Arweave, which is unfortunate. Yeah, if anyone's curious, I could go on a whole diatribe about why I think Arweave is a bad idea, but let me I'll summarize it or actually forget all of the technical reasons why Arweave is bad. So Arweave is a blockchain, and here's some info for you. It's a blockchain that only has 100 nodes, has 100 computers. You know, Ethereum has tens of thousands. IPFS has, I think, hundreds of thousands. Arweave has like 100 computers that are actually running the entire network. It used to have up to 50,000, but they moved off of Arweave to use their computers for other purposes because Arweave wasn't profitable enough. And when the whole idea of Arweave is making permanent storage profitable, and all of these folks moved off of Arweave because it wasn't profitable, and the security of that data depends on there being enough nodes on the network to store that data. To me, that's a really scary sign that Arweave is probably on the brink of collapse. The one thing to note is that because it is a blockchain and it has its own cryptocurrency, there are a lot of people who don't care about data storage, who don't care about the purpose of Arweave, which is to store data. They care about dollars going up. They own a bunch of Arweave tokens and are working really hard to pump Arweave so that their value will go up so they can offload their bags on somebody. Those are the only people I see saying anything good about Arweave on Twitter, unfortunately. Yeah, I'm not sure about Solana's version of Manifold, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of new self-custody contract startups going. And on Tezos, I love Tezos. Actually, Club NFT from the beginning of our company has been supporting Tezos. Even we actually have some features that only work on Tezos. We have a artist NFT discovery tool, which is actually really awesome. It kind of like is magical. If you're a collector, helps you find new and emerging artists that people like you are just discovering themselves. So it kind of keeps you on the hip of what's new and cool in the style of collecting that you're into, whatever that may be. But that only works on Tezos. I love Tezos, A, because of the community ever since the Hicket Nunk days. B, because it's so tightly knit that actually all of the platforms, all the marketplaces are very quick to adopt the same best practices and work to be interoperable and work together on things. So that's why, we consider IPFS a best practice. 99% of Tezos NFTs use IPFS because they all agree it's the best practice and they all worked on that together to do it right, So yeah, Tezos is great. It's a bit smaller community. It's, the things sell for less dollars, but there's also a lot of volume. It's a great place to find one-of-one type work. If you're into PSPs, Ethereum is your place. If you're into a lot of like really interesting art from like, individual artists, you'll find that on Tezos. And since there's high volume of sales, or relatively high because the prices are lower and more active community, it's really a great source of data, especially for all of the algorithms that Club NFT is building. It makes it really easy to build cool things like a NFT and artist discovery platform. Inform function, interesting. Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting about these self-custody contract things is it's not clear how they can possibly make money since they're giving you the tools to create your own smart contract. And since you own the smart contract, you can kind of choose whether or not to give them a slice of your revenue or not. And by default, I think they understand that they aren't going to get that money. So it's not clear to me how a business like Manifold or Form Function can survive. One thing that's interesting, I mentioned that there will be a separation between the marketplace where you have the collector's eyeballs and you do the buying and selling, and the tools to create stuff. So Manifold Studio, they created the tools to create stuff and you own it and it's entirely yours. And they have also created a marketplace offering. And that's how at least Manifold is going to try to make some money. I'd be curious to see if Form Function tried that and failed, or if they never got to that point. And yeah, so blockchain will be eventually owned by big business. There are two levels to this. One is who's running the nodes, who's running the servers that run the blockchain, and it's important that that try to be as diversified as possible, just for security reasons. And then separately, the question is, who's going to own the majority of things on the blockchain, cryptocurrencies and whatever. I think realistically, there will be a long tail. There are going to be a few people who own a lot of things, whether it's just assets on the blockchain or servers that run the blockchain. And then there's going to be a lot of people who own one or two. It'll be important to try to make sure that there's no kind of cartel of folks who own together 51% of the computing power. One thing that, for Ethereum, for example, I know Infura runs like a large amount of Ethereum. One of the interesting things is that the move to proof of stake actually made the question of who owns 51% of what runs the blockchain and who owns the majority of the money on the blockchain, it made that the same question. So now whoever owns the most money also has way more control over what the blockchain does. So that was actually a little scary to me. Fortunately, I can't think of anyone who owns 51% of Ethereum, but it's something to think about. It'll be important to keep track of these addresses, and it's all somewhat anonymous. There is definitely some space there for some people to do some internet sleuthing to try to figure out who actually owns most of the control here. I'm not very familiar with Cardano. I'm sorry. Look, I'm not a blockchain maxi. I don't know much about Solana. I know that a lot of investors poured money into it, but that there doesn't seem to be much of an organic community on Solana. I think that could come because I think some of the tools are really great, but I don't know. I think I see a big active community on Tezos. I see I see, I guess, really a small but very well-financed community on Ethereum. There aren't actually a lot of sales happening, but they tend to be much larger. I don't know anything about Cardano, but if I had to guess as to, name 3 blockchains that will still be around in 10 years, I'd say Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Tezos in that order, probably. I don't know about Cardano. Well, I think I've already run over my time and I don't want to keep you all too late. No problem. I'm gonna throw my info in the chat. Please feel free to email, DM. My DMs are open. I'm always happy to answer questions, and I haven't been very active on Twitter lately, but if you do post a public question, that's my preference so that everyone can see the answer. But yeah, thank you all so much, and hope this was worthwhile.